Can you hear me okay? All right, there we go. Like Mr. Call said, my name's Brett Bricker. I coach at KU and Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart. Today we're talking about Russia. We good? Okay. Kind of a sucker for a good map. Take a look at this for a second, please. And tell me what you can learn about Russia just from this map. Okay, you can raise your hand. Go ahead. Yeah. It's huge. Okay. Largest landmass. It's the largest country in the world. What else can we learn? Yep.
It shares borders with a lot of different countries.
Okay, good. It shares borders with a lot of different countries. 14, so 13 of them they share a border with the mainland Russia, and then Poland also shares a border with Kaliningrad. What else can we learn? Perfect, okay? It has a humongous Arctic coastline. So they have the largest Arctic coastline, about 53% of coastline in the Arctic is Russian, and about half of territorial ownership in the Arctic is also Russian. Where's the United States? Okay, like staged left, right? Okay, so by the Bering Sea. Does Russia share a border with any NATO countries? Yes, okay. That's good to note. I would say that the last kind of, the reference to the United States, I think the last kind of major takeaway from this is that there are two Russian fronts of aggression. So for affirmative or negative teams that are this year talking about conflict with Russia, some of them are going to be talking about the Arctic space that is stage, I guess, left. I don't know stage stuff. Okay, so this side, European side. So that would be a conflict with Norway, kind of the NATO states over here. And there's also a relatively, strong set of evidence that says that there is a risk of aggression on the Pacific side as well, with the United States, Japan, etc. So it's big, a lot of Arctic, two major fronts of aggression, and shares borders with NATO states. So I gave this lecture to the 7-week camp about 3 weeks ago, and I'll still give that part of this lecture, but since then I've judged about 25 debates, and almost every one of those debates has included something about Russia. So I thought it would be more useful to kind of start this by just demonstrating, or I guess talking through some of the Russia-specific debates that I've already seen, and maybe give you all a preview of both what you need to know and also just demonstrating the importance of understanding the complexities of Russia as it relates to your upcoming weeks here. Okay, so this slide is just the things that are happening at camp already about Russia. Some of this will be demonstrated in the starter packet. Some of this is the larger set of 7-week files that have been produced thus far. Okay, I would say that as affirmatives talk about Russia, they basically can be categorized into 3. The first is the be mean to Russia AF. So this is we need to step up our kind of military posture, or we need to enhance our military assets in a way that makes it so Russia is less likely to incite aggression. Can people think of affirmatives that fall into this category? Somebody said ADAC. They didn't raise their hand, but I saw it. Okay. Other affirmatives that fall into this category? Yep. Okay, domain awareness kind of falls into this category. I think there are parts of that affirmative that certainly do try to enhance deterrence against Russia. In particular, the missile threats internal link that says that Russia's going to first strike the United States and that we basically need to capture that with an effective missile defense. There's a logistics affirmative that's been produced that basically says that there's going to be a two-front war and we need more enhanced military logistics in Alaska. Okay, I went out of order, but be nice to Russia. This is we can effectively cooperate with them. We can settle our tensions through communication. Can people think of AFs that fall into this category? Yep.
Security cooperation.
Perfect, the security cooperation affirmative. Any others? Yep. Science diplomacy? Good, so are there any others? people seen, this might have been what you meant by security cooperation, but the Coast Guard Forum AF that re-invites Russia to the frozen Coast Guard Forum. Yep. FNPPs. Okay, I actually don't know much about that app, but I trust you. So there's the be mean, let's deter. There's the be nice, let's generate more communication, try to develop a more solid relationship. And then there's the third category, which is kind of prepare for the worst. And this is more where I would put maritime domain awareness. A lot of the kind of theses of that AF is, or kind of one of the central claims of that AF is that Russia might not be like intentionally starting a war with the United States, but the United States needs to be prepared to be able to ascertain whether or not an act of aggression was intentional or accidental. And one way that we do that is to have more effective attribution. So basically knowing what's happening in the region can mean that we don't overreact and other countries don't overreact to what's called gray zone aggression, which we'll talk about that more in a second. Second is the Putin DA. Raise your hand if you've read this in a debate. Okay, limited number. This is the most, so we've had 2 tournaments in the lab that I'm running. This was the most common 2NR in both of those tournaments. It also won the finals debate in our second tournament. So I think that this DA is like popular. I have no idea whether or not its popularity will continue into the season. But the basic argument is that the affirmative in some way minimizes Putin's hold on power in Russia and causes either a perceived coup or an actual coup. We're going to go much more in depth to this argument as we talk about Russia's strategic interests in the Arctic, but it's basically like a Russian politics DA, for those of you that are more familiar with like domestic politics DAs. Third, the US-Russia relations DA. So this disadvantage is mostly against those affirmatives that are trying to either be mean to Russia or prepare for the worst with Russia. That might hinder elements of US-Russia cooperation. Can anybody think of the most obvious problem with this DA? What's the status of US-Russia relations in the status quo? Pretty small, okay? They are not doing terribly well. So this disadvantage I have seen really struggle at the uniqueness level, both because of the Ukraine conflict itself, but also because of some of the spillover effects of the Ukraine conflict. So, for example, because of the Ukraine conflict, the United States has limited cooperation in a variety of Arctic areas with Russia. We've cut off several of our arms control negotiations. We really don't have much government-to-government or military-to-military contact with Russia, so the uniqueness to this DA kind of struggles. There are a couple of good negative pieces of uniqueness evidence, but I think on the whole, this disadvantage needs a pretty dramatic change of events that I don't know if I really foresee coming. Fourth, the strategic stability DA. This is in the case neg to the maritime domain awareness affirmative, but it's been kind of patchworked to be a disadvantage versus other affirmatives as well. This position argues that the most secure way to avoid a nuclear war with Russia is to make sure that mutually assured destruction will hold. So Russia and the United States both need to know that if a conflict breaks out, each of them will basically be dying in that conflict, mutually assured destruction. There are some ways in which affirmatives on this topic might limit Russia's ability to feel secure to live through a conflict. So Russia's military, despite Western media coverage, Russia's military is not terribly strong. Okay, they have a lot of people and a lot of weapons, but it's wildly outdated. But the one thing about their military that is actually top of the line is their subs. So their submarines are basically their security blanket, and they know that if they have those submarines that can each launch nuclear warheads, then in the event of a conflict, other countries are unlikely to first strike Russia because they know that these submarines, which are highly capable and usually secret, would be able to respond. So this disadvantage argues that the affirmative in some way undermines Russia's security in their second strike, and usually, at least as it relates to the Arctic, that is through tracking or finding Russian subs. Fifth is the Russian economy DA. This is pretty straightforward. Russia's economy, Russia is actively using the Northern Sea Route, and they are actively developing resources in the Arctic. They plan to use the Arctic in the future as a way to demonstrate economic resilience and to avoid Western sanctions. And the plan, by promoting some US control of the Arctic, would undermine Russia's ability to do that. The Arctic Council DA. This disadvantage has a variety of link arguments, but the best one as it relates to Russia is that if you cooperate with Russia, then it hurts the Arctic Council, because the US and the Arctic Council basically agreed to freeze Russia out of the Arctic Council. So if the US goes to Russia and says, hey, just kidding, we're like totally willing to cooperate with you in the Arctic, the other Arctic Council member states that we've gone to and said we need to freeze Russia out, backlash, and that undermines the kind of long-term viability of the Arctic Council. People have said Russia war good. Those files are out. There's a consult NATO counterplan. There's a Russia revisionism file, which will be like, I don't know, a meaningful chunk of what's coming in this lecture. And gray zone aggression, good. So this is another file that's coming out that I think is like pretty strategic and will have a pretty big impact on the season. So for those of you that are reading affirmatives that talk about US-Russia war, one of the most common internal link explanations is that there will be gray zone aggression. And the kind of implication of that is that gray zone aggression will lead to war. Does anybody know like a kind of more formal definition of what gray zone aggression is? Yep.
It's like border skirmishes.
Border skirmishes is an example, for sure. Yep. Do we have a definition? Yeah.
Wants a coffee-based direct military confrontation, but that's kind of in the middle leading up to its IUS.
Okay, so it's not direct or formal military confrontation, and in fact, it's intentionally trying to stay below the threshold of warfare. So most gray zone aggression is not trying to kill people in other countries. It's kind of trying to demonstrate power or dissuade the other country from believing that they are at war with you by doing kind of like smaller, low-level tactics. So this reference was to cyber aggression. We had a reference to border skirmishes. So when Russia flies a bomber into Alaskan airspace, they're not doing so to start a war with the United States. They're doing so to demonstrate aggression and to kind of lay claim or maybe react to something that the United States has done. That's an example of gray zone aggression. It stays below the threshold of warfare. Most affirmative internal links say that this will cause a war. There's a set of arguments that says that it's actually very good at preventing war. So I think that this will kind of, as the camp unfolds, this debate will get better and better. Finally, there's warming good. Has anybody seen a warming good argument as it relates to Russia? Yep.
I haven't debated anybody who actually said global warming will make Siberia more habitable and will stop Russian aggression because it will really boost their economy.
Okay, warming good for the Russian economy is actually something that's been around in debate for like 20, 30 years. It makes more areas of Russia agrarian, so like you can grow crops in them, and it opens up more resource access to Russia. The other kind of component of this deals with the Russia-China alliance. Right now, there is a Russia-China alliance because China needs to rely on Russia for a lot of its Arctic capacity. And if warming happens, China won't need to rely on Russia, and it splits the Russia-China alliance. So why did I go through all of these things? Okay, you should know that this is like basically the Russia topic, okay? I think it's kind of the Russia and the natives topic. That's kind of like my picture, my kind of crystal ball about where this topic is headed. So what I'm about to say next about kind of the basics of Russia might sound really like simple, but just making sure that you're on top of some of these basics and making sure that you know some of the kind of foundational elements about debating Russia is really important, just because it's background knowledge for like what I think 2/3 of the topic might end up being. Okay, so where are we going now? 3 places. We're going to talk about basic facts about Russia. We're going to talk about Russia in the Arctic, and we're going to talk about tips for debating Russia. I'm going to send these slides out to your lab leaders, and they'll give them to you. So if you like miss something in your notes, I think it's maybe more important to like listen to implications than it is to have the exact facts laid out. Okay, Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. Russia has the largest landmass in the world. They are a permanent UN Security Council member. That means that they hold veto power over basically anything that the United Nations would do that would run counter to their perceived interests. They have the world's largest nuclear arsenal. They are authoritarian. They do have elections. Most election observers say that those elections are not free and fair. They have a very limited civil society, so opportunities for protest, free speech, and media, independent media, are really difficult. They have a mixed market economy, which means that they have a lot of state-owned enterprises, but they also have some independent corporations. If you own like a really, really good business in Russia, it's likely to eventually be owned by the state. So a lot of their most money-making capacity or capability ends up being state-owned. And they export minerals, petroleum, gas, and wheat. Okay, they neighbor 14 countries, which you can see from that map above. So this is the ones that they have explicit land borders with. So the Arctic states are bolded. It's just Norway and Finland. But the NATO member states are asterisked. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And remember, Poland is via Kaliningrad. It's also important to note that they share narrow maritime borders with several other countries that are not on this list. So does anybody know how far apart the United States and Russia are? Yeah. 50 miles. Okay, so depending on who you ask, they're either 2 miles apart because there's some like really, really small uninhabited islands that are about 2 miles apart, but most people say about 53 miles apart, the United States and Russia. The two other major countries that share a narrow maritime border with Russia are Japan, and that matters because they have territorial conflict over the Kuril Islands, and Turkey, and they share a maritime border with Turkey through the Black Sea. Somebody already said like they have a lot of neighbors, and I think that's kind of the purpose here. What you need to know is that any one of these NATO member states that they have a border with, Russia views with enmity. Basically, they think that they are that. I don't know if they think this. They oftentimes publicly portray that these countries are genuinely aggressive towards Russian ethnic populations in their countries, that they pose a threat to the kind of reinstantiation of power of Russia. So those are the countries that I think are like potential kind of like war vectors for Russia. Okay, Russia has both territorial aggression ongoing and territorial disputes ongoing. So they have territorial aggression in Ukraine and Crimea, in Georgia and Moldova. And importantly, for some stories we're going to talk about in a bit, Russia has publicly said that they are willing to protect Russian populations globally. And they consistently use the phrase willingness to protect. So, for example, if there is a Russian Orthodox church that is facing persecution in a country, Russia says that no matter where that country is, Russia has a willingness to protect those people, which basically says that they are kind of like have justification for intervention in a large kind of more than just close to their territory. And then they have territorial disputes with China, Japan, Norway, and most Soviet states. The Norway one here is bolded because it's kind of interesting. And we'll talk about that story in a second, but remember that Norway is a NATO state, so an act of aggression against Norway is an act of aggression against all NATO member states, including the United States. So if we talk about conflict vectors in the Arctic, at least on the European side, Norway is probably the most likely. I know I'm going through kind of quickly here. These are just basic facts. Like, you should know these when debating about Russia. More of this discussion is going to be focused on the Arctic in a second. I do think we need to talk a little bit about Ukraine. So Ukraine is not an Arctic state, and it is not a NATO state, but so many Russia debates need to think about the way that Ukraine interacts with the conflict explanation. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a large-scale conflict. It began in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea, and it escalated dramatically in 2022. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And depending on kind of your political or geopolitical perspective, you can talk about what this war stemmed from, but Russia's explanation for this conflict is that Ukraine was beginning to align itself with European states, closely tying itself to Western institutions, potentially joining NATO and the European Union, and therefore this Russia's act of aggression was kind of to prevent those actions from occurring. This conflict did run directly counter to kind of the agreement between Russia and the West to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine. So the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia and the West that said that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. So Ukraine had nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union in exchange for protection and respect of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. So Russia, the US, the UK, they all agreed to this, and they all agreed to respect Ukrainian independence. So it violated the Budapest Agreement, and it was kind of probably the most clear example of Russian, quote, revisionism, because they were explicitly revising the international order, in particular, the clarity of a country's borders. So the reason why this really matters is twofold. One, the existence of the conflict in Ukraine, according to what I think are probably the most qualified people talking about this, dramatically lower the risk of Russia creating a new conflict in the Arctic. Why? Yep. They don't want to spread themselves too thin. Perfect. Okay, if you're like basically embroiled in a major one-front war, opening another front might sound like interesting because it's a distraction, but that increases the propensity of losing both of those conflicts. So the existence of Ukraine, like despite the fact that it demonstrates Russian territorial aggression to a really significant degree, actually might make an Arctic conflict a little bit less likely. The second reason why you need to know about Ukraine as it relates to your Arctic debates is what I'll refer to a couple times as the Putin playbook. Okay? The Putin playbook is the idea that what happened in Ukraine can happen elsewhere. So what Putin did in Ukraine was he identified a population that was ethnically Russian. He argued that there was a historical justification to treat that territory as Russian, both because of some kind of narrative of history, but also because of the existence of those ethnic Russians. Claim that Russia has a responsibility to protect those people, and then escalate, starting with hybrid warfare, and then basing national pride on that. Okay, so that's like basically what happened in Ukraine. And what we'll talk about in a little bit is just that same playbook has already started in Norway. And that's kind of like maybe an odd thing for us to think about, because like maybe we don't know a ton about that yet. But the Putin playbook is like halfway done in Norway. Okay, the other thing that is important to note about Ukraine is when you talk about Russia, I think it's important to consider how a conflict actually happens or escalates. And I think that there are kind of three ways that you can think about this. One is the Russian emboldenment theory, which is like if Russia takes another territory and wins, then they take more territory in the future. So maybe a win in Ukraine for Russia means that they think that they can succeed in executing this Putin playbook. Ukraine could escalate via a loss. So this is, Putin has an autobiography where he tells this story that's been consistently referenced in Western media as the parable of the rat. Anybody familiar? Okay, so when Putin was a child, he and his friends, would play, and at one point they they were living in like a rat-infested apartment, basically. And they would play around with these rats, and one day, Putin chased one of these rats into the corner, and it was the largest rat. Okay, and I think Putin was maybe playing or thought he was going to kill this rat or whatever. But what happened was once this rat was trapped in a corner and had no other escape, this rat actually attacked young Putin. Okay, so it gave up on running away. And this is, in his autobiography is kind of like an odd tale about his childhood, but it's possible that this was placed there either intentionally or at least Western media has kind of latched onto this story. And what's the analog for how we might think about that now? Yep.
I think it's about enslavement of Russia, and it could be intentionally
case there, as he said, to show like the allies to us that if you try to trap Russia, they will.
Okay, perfect. Like Putin said, like what happens when something gets cornered? He knows when something is cornered and it has no other chance, no other opportunity, there's a lash out coming. Okay, so what Putin is trying to kind of demonstrate here, or to analog, is that if the West truly encircles Russia and there's no other opportunity for Russian kind of success or future, that's when the worst form of lash out occurs. So it's kind of this like big deterrent, theme. There are other vectors for conflict. So miscalc, this could just be like nobody intended to start the war, but a bunch of people died and that war escalated. Or like the death of US soldiers. I think like if Russia killed 50 US service people, I would imagine that the American public would be outraged enough that they would demand a response. I'm not sure if that equals nuclear war and extinction in the debate sense, but it might be a vector for conflict escalation that actually makes a little bit of sense. Okay, part 2, Russia in the Arctic. So you know this already. We kind of talked about this based on the first map that we looked at. So this map, in this map, Russia is green. So this picture is from The Economist in 2022. And here's some important notes. So Russia dominates both the territory and the coastline of the Arctic. So they have 53% of the Arctic coastline, and they control 45% of the geographic Arctic. Of the 4 million people that live in the Arctic, 2.5 million of them are Russian. The other major takeaway from this is, where's the US? There's that little thing at the bottom, right? Like compared to Russia, the United States is like barely an Arctic state. Okay, we might, act like we're having a topic about it, so we like seem to demonstrate that we like think it's important enough for the United States to care about, but as like a component of our identity, of our future, of our economy, it's just much, much smaller than Russia. And like, honestly, like most people don't care about Alaska. Like Alaskan Congress people consistently say like Alaska's forgotten about. Like the reason why you always hear the Alaskan Congress people kind of trying to, demonstrate their power or to lobby for Alaska is that it doesn't really come naturally to the American people to care a lot about Alaska. It's hard, there are not that many people that live there, they have a really struggling economy, and a lot of people think that they don't contribute very much to like American basic needs and defense. So we don't care that much about the Arctic. So, but Russia does, and kind of the explanation of that will come. Okay, so what is Russia doing here? Why do they care? There are two pretty useful sources on this subject that I recommend. Like, if you're just like kind of like a debate nerd or maybe going to become a Russia nerd, you got to read these full texts. So Elizabeth Buchanan wrote a book called The Red Arctic, and it is I guess maybe a somewhat optimistic read of Putin's ambitions in the Arctic. Her argument is that the Western media has kind of like latched on to a lot of other Russian aggression and thought that that just does apply in the Arctic. And her argument is it really doesn't. That Russia has massive incentives to maintain peace in the Arctic, that they do not want to start wars, and that that basically like the West has got it wrong. Their motivations in Ukraine are not analogous to their motivations in the Arctic. The second source up here is this Elmore article that if you read the Putin DA pops up over and over and over again. And it says that political scientists, when talking about Russia, think of them as either a revisionist state or a not revisionist state. But in fact, there's like a much more important third motivation for their conflict, or for their actions, which is regime stability. Okay, this is the same map we looked at earlier with one small amendment. What's that amendment? I had someone who knows more about technology than me create a little circle. Okay, do people know what that circle is? So that circle is the Kola Peninsula. So that's the like Russian part of this. As we talk about Russian strategic interests in the Arctic, the Kola Peninsula stands out as probably the most important component of Russian interests in the Arctic. I'm going to show one card. Is that large enough and visible for you all? I can read it to you if it's not. Okay, thank you. Okay, earlier that I mentioned that Russia's security almost entirely depends on the existence of its SSBN forces. They think that other countries are very unlikely to start a nuclear war against Russia as long as Russia has subs that can respond. Now, the reason why this matters is that that peninsula houses the most important Russian SSBN boomers. As Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, and as Norway shares a border with Russia, they have gained the ability to patrol the area where Russian subs need to basically move. So they're the Russian safety blanket, and you can think about this as either an advantage or a disadvantage. If Russia has a safety blanket in their subs, they are less likely to think that any country is going to first strike them. So conflict just naturally de-escalates, and the likelihood that Russia feels the need to use a nuke first is much, much lower because they know that they have a secure second strike. But this is also an opportunity for Russia to feel too secure. If Russia knows that no country can use a nuclear weapon against them, then they can act with their own forms of nuclear coercion. So thought of this way, the fact that Russia knows that they're so safe from anybody using a nuke against them might actually mean that they would be willing to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or elsewhere. That area, the Kola Peninsula, is one of the most important areas in the world for preventing nuclear war. And given its importance, Russia is taking kind of direct action to make sure that their subs are secure. So I'm going to show at least one more card. I'll let you read it, and then I'll give you the kind of the background of where this is headed. Okay, remember the Putin playbook. You find a group of ethnic Russians. You say that they're living in what should be Russian territory. You take acts to protect them. You initiate hybrid warfare, and you convince the Russian populace that it's basically a component of their national identity to continue to fight and win that war. Okay, this is the territorial dispute between the United States, or between Russia and Norway. When Russia and Norway divided their border in the early 1800s, they thought, well, it makes sense, it makes the most sense to just decide that the border follows this natural river. Unfortunately, there was a Russian Orthodox church on the Norway side of that river. So Norway said, okay, sure, like you get this part of this territory on this side of the river. Probably didn't seem like a huge deal at the time. Now, not only is that component of Norway, because it's on the other side of the river, Russian, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Norway is saying, actually, every Russian Orthodox Church is Russian, in Norway. So not just this one, like we said that it was this one, but because there are more of them, there's actually Russian dots all along Norway. And it turns out that some of those are in really important strategic locations. So for example, in Sweden, there's a Russian Orthodox church right next to a NATO military base. So Russia is using this to kind of sow the seeds of the first step of the Putin playbook. Okay? So this is in Norway. Not just that, Russia is continuously using hybrid and gray zone aggression against Norway. So civilian life in northern Norway is under constant attack. Russian hackers have targeted small municipalities and ports with phishing scam, ransomware, cyber warfare. They sent tourists photographing sensitive defense and communication infrastructure. There's been sabotage of train lines, gas facilities that supply energy to much of Europe. Norway has a fishing port where Russia has sent a lot of fishermen, which end up doing military exercises on the docks of those fishing boats. And Norway has said that these fishers have gotten younger and younger and younger. They're all male, and they are in very good shape and oftentimes don't know anything about fishing. Okay? So the kind of step 2 of the Putin playbook in Norway has started. There's a territory. It has ethnic Russians. There's a dispute about it. Russia starts hybrid warfare in those areas. I'm not really trying to say, like, I think it doesn't make that much sense for Russia to launch a full-scale invasion of a NATO country, but at least step 1 and step 2 are playing out in places other than Ukraine. And at least I think that this has a lot to do with what Russia thinks is its most important strategic asset, which is the Kola Peninsula. It's important to note that the dynamics surrounding the Kola Peninsula are changing. Let me, I skipped a slide earlier that I actually took it out for some reason, but I think I need to say it, okay? The subs in the Kola Peninsula have to travel north and west through the Bear Gap and the Jiuk Gap. Okay, so they have basically, in order to get out to the Atlantic, they have to travel through NATO-patrolled territory that is relatively shallow. So when a sub leaves, a lot of times NATO or the United States just has another sub there waiting to tail it and track it, so we can know where Russian subs are. So Russia does like a lot of evasive maneuvering techniques, and their goal is to basically escape that tail. As the world warms, those dynamics are going to change. One kind of better for the NATO tracking and one for the worse. Okay? So melting ice means that more submarines will be able to easily traverse the Arctic. Okay? It's a submarine, so it's under the ice, so it can already traverse the Arctic, but there are some limitations on doing so. So for example, if a sub needs to communicate, it might need to penetrate the ice. If the sub is having some form of malfunction or difficulty, it needs to penetrate the ice. So as that ice melts, the Arctic Arctic subs will be able to traverse the Arctic with more ease. Yep. Yes, warming, good, because it makes Russia feel more secure in their second strike. That is coming, and it will be out by Saturday. Yep, nice work. The other kind of element, oh yeah. Yeah.
Previous lecture, we learned that ICE is able to prevent, ASW capabilities from seeing submarines. Would warming also increase the ability to detect subs?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. And the dynamics of this are running against each other. So it makes the sea more transparent, and warmer water actually makes sonar more effective. So there are ways in which warming can cause this and ways in which warming can hinder this, for sure. But the important note is it's changing. This dynamic of this really small territory where all of Russian subs have to get out of to get to the Atlantic, that is changing. We don't know if that's for the better or for the worse, and that's I think, up for debate. Okay. Strategic interest number 2. So why does Russia care about the Arctic? 1, the Kola Peninsula. 2, national identity. This might seem weird to Americans, okay? You all, I imagine most of you are American, don't care about the Arctic. Maybe you've been on a tour in Alaska or a cruise or something, but you don't think of Alaska and think that is where our future lies, okay? That's actually not, the converse of that is true in Russia. We're going to watch one quick 2-minute clip that demonstrates this.
The United States and most Americans don't identify as an Arctic nation. We don't tend to think of ourselves as part of the Arctic in this country. It's very far away from most Americans' lived experience. In Russia, by contrast, the Russian Arctic identity is a central part of Russia's sense of place and sense of self. It's an enormous point of pride to Russians that they have a huge Arctic territory, that they have advanced Arctic capabilities, that the Arctic is sort of a core part of their place in the world. And so that means that for Russia, their strategic calculus around the Arctic is bigger than just a military economic calculus. And it also means that when President Putin directs activities in the Arctic, whether it's construction or military exercises, he's got an eye on the domestic audience and the domestic political effects of those moves, more or perhaps equal to the practical effects. So for example, when you see something like a flag planting at the North Pole in 2007, or you see Russian paratroopers dropping onto the ice at the North Pole, or Russian scientists unfurling a giant Russian flag across the ice. Yes, that's signaling to the United States and NATO, but it's also signaling to the Russian people that Russia is an Arctic state, that we are strong and proud in the Arctic. And that has a really important domestic political benefit for Putin, particularly at a moment like today where Russia is weak and challenged on many fronts. Pointing to the Arctic as a source of strength, an area of dominance and power and capabilities is really one of the sort of trump cards that Putin can still play.
Okay, that's the transcription of this card. That is in the, you don't need to read it, that's exactly what she said. That's in the Putin disadvantage. So like, when I started, I said that like the most popular DA on the topic thus far is the Putin politics DA. I hope some of you were like, that makes no sense. Okay, like Putin isn't, or like Russia's an authoritarian state. They don't have free and fair elections. They don't have protest. They don't have civil society. As a politics DA, like it's even less, makes less sense than what's going on in the United States right now. I hope that that was at least some of your reactions, okay? I think that what that reaction, that was my first reaction. I think what that reaction kind of misses is the strategic importance of the Arctic and Russia as the dominant Arctic state for Russian domestic politics. Okay, Russia's lost a lot. They've lost a lot economically. They've lost a lot since the Soviet Union territorially. They might be losing a war right now. And it is a consistent refrain in Russian politics that they are at least the kind of like lead power of what will likely be a center of kind of economic and strategic interests in the future, and that's the Arctic, okay? That's a domestic argument that unifies the populace and makes it so Putin has the support that he needs to maintain other unpopular initiatives, like the war in Ukraine and like aggression that causes Western sanctions against Russia, okay? So, strategic interest number 3 is economics. So Pinka said, you know, when Russia does all of these actions in the Arctic, when they drop a paratrooper, when they roll out a flag, when they plant a flag on the North Pole, there are 3 interests. There are military, there are political, and there are economic. This is, I mean, kind of self-evident from the way that a lot of you are explaining your advantages. Why does Russia care? Well, there are resources there. There are rare earth minerals, there's oil, and there's gas. Second, the Arctic provides an opportunity for sanctions relief. Given the difficulty that the West has in traversing the Arctic, it is possible for Russia to basically use the Arctic to evade traditional sanctions enforcement. So, sanctions might actually be really devastating for their economy if they didn't have such power in the Arctic. Third, they can control the northern sea route. remember that image of Russian territory basically taking up half of the Arctic. The fastest way to transport goods from Europe to Asia is directly through Russian territory. And there's evidence that says that if the Arctic is free of ice, about 80% of global trade will go through Russian-controlled Northern Sea route. What do they get with that? They get the ability to control trade, they can tariff, they can tax, they can deny access to enemies, all of which kind of could be a way that they could lever power in the future. Okay, I want to talk for a little bit now about the Putin DA specifically, just because I think understanding the intricacies of that might make your upcoming debates a little bit better. To do that, I want to talk about Prigozhin. Anybody know the name Prigozhin? Like who they are, what they did? Yep. Yeah, so he was opposition to Putin. He was a former friend, then turned potential coup-er. Yep. Yeah, he was the head of the Wagner Group, and he kind of put in place what looked like was going to be a coup inside of Russia. This was only 2 years ago, okay? I don't know, like, for me, this was like mind-blowing. Like, I don't watch much TV news, but I was like glued to the TV while this was happening to figure out kind of what was coming next inside of Russia. So a little bit of background. The Wagner Group was a mercenary group funded by the Russian state that basically gave the Russian state plausible deniability to do terrible stuff overseas and domestically, okay? So the Wagner Group, like, basically would overthrow governments, they would commit human rights violations, and they were all funded by the Russian government. So Prigozhin and Putin were pals. Prigozhin and the Wagner Group thought that the Ukraine war was not going well. Russia was losing, and they were having strategic mistakes. So Prigozhin decided, I'm going to take over at least the Russian military or the government, and this happened just 2 years ago. So we were like basically on the brink of the largest country in the world with the most nuclear weapons going into a civil war.
Watch weeknights at 5 and 6.
Sorry, I didn't know that you would get ads. Oh, come on. There we go.
The Wagner March on Moscow is one of the most publicly documented incidents of the Ukraine conflict. More than 130 videos have been verified by Sky News and the Center for Information Resilience. The journey began in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, Russia's logistics hub for its operations in Ukraine. This video shows the arrival of Prigozhin's troops. Armed Wagner soldiers, tanks and armoured vehicles took up positions in the city centre early on Saturday. Around the same time, Prigozhin shared footage of himself inside the Russian military HQ.
Мы находимся в штабе, 7 часов 30 минут утра, под контролем военные объекты Ростова, в том числе аэродром. Самолеты, которые уходят для боевой работы, уходят штатно, проблем никаких нету. Санитарные борта уходят, проблем нет. Все, что делается, это мы взяли под контроль, чтобы штурмовая авиация не наносила удары по нам, а наносила по украинцам.
Later, this clip was filmed at a car dealership on the outskirts of Voronezh city. Men in green fatigues, thought to be Wagner fighters, fire what looks like an anti-aircraft missile. The missile appears to be aimed at a Russian military helicopter.
Оттуда вон ракеты.
This video shows a helicopter, possibly the same one, narrowly evading being hit by a rocket. It only just misses the person behind the camera. This clip shows large military trucks in Moscow's Kamovniki district on Friday evening. Here, Russian security forces formed roadblocks in the city's Yaseneva district on the Saturday.
Okay, so remember there's not really independent media in Russia, so all of these things are like, you know, TikTok videos that have gone viral on Telegram or something. But like what this story is trying to demonstrate is that the Wagner group coalesced and started a march towards Moscow. In doing so, they took over military bases, including command of fighter jets, and they said that, you know, they were not there to use those fighter jets for any other reason than to protect themselves and make sure the war kind of fighting continued. So they were, I think, enacting a coup. Anybody know what happened next? Yeah. Yeah, so he turned around. Nobody really knows what happened in that conversation. And then he died. Okay? I think his plane blew up. Maybe his helicopter. I think it was a plane, but plane? Okay. So, you know, like Putin and Prigozhin sat down and they were like, nah, let's call it all's fair. And Prigozhin comes out like days after this and is like, what? Oh, protest? A coup? No, we were just peacefully protesting. We were just driving up there to have a conversation with Putin. Okay, so like they act like everything is cool, like a coup had not occurred. A few months later, death. Okay, so Prigozhin learned a valuable lesson, which is don't turn on Putin. But the problem is that Prigozhin also demonstrated one thing, which is the kind of viability and resilience of the Putin regime is much, much more brittle than one would really hope. Okay, so you can kind of, yeah.
Wait, so did he like take over stuff and then launch on Ukraine, or when he took over, he marched back to Moscow?
So when he took over military assets along the way, he said two things basically. We're trying to make sure that we're just still using these for Ukraine. We're fighting Ukraine. We're not going to use these against Moscow. But in this video, what he's really saying is we're taking these over so Moscow doesn't use them against us. I think more important is the like symbol this is sending, which is, hey, like we have control of military stuff. Like I am in command. And that's like both an important signal to potentially the Russian people, but also to the West. Because if you're sitting in like the White House watching this unfold, you're probably thinking like, oh my God, what's going to happen to their thousands of nuclear weapons? Is this going to be a coup? And who are we going to be negotiating with 24 hours from now? And that's Prigozhin's way of saying, to be clear, it's me. I'm the guy. You're going to have to come talk to me after this, which I think is why you send this video in fatigues from a Russian military headquarters on this march. Okay, so the Putin DA. That video demonstrates that the possibility of a Russian state collapse is real. Okay? So the disadvantage argues that it is real, but it is actually unlikely to occur in the status quo because Putin has kind of a fragile hold on power. That's the uniqueness argument for the DA. I think the best link to the DA says that the plan causes Russia to lose power in the Arctic. They are deterred from doing some of those things that they need to do to demonstrate that they are winning. After the AF, Russia does not drop paramilitary troopers in the Arctic. Russia does not have complete control of the Northern Sea route. The United States instead, and NATO, are sending military assets closer and closer to Russia. That link has won a lot of debates versus AFs like the logistics AF that says that we should build up our military in Alaska so we can make sure that we can effectively patrol the Arctic. It's won debates versus the Maritime Domain Awareness Affirmative that says that we should enhance our military assets in the Arctic, even if those are kind of purely for defensive purposes. And the best explanation of this is not that the plan alone causes Putin to collapse, but the fact that Russia is deterred, that they're forced to back down from acts of aggression in the Arctic, make either the public or the selectorate, which is like the group of elites that keep Putin in power, to turn on him. So the story of this DA is basically like, there's a lot of unpopular stuff happening in Russia. What's the one thing that Putin has going for him? Strong control of the Arctic. If you remember that Pincus video from earlier, she says that this is like the trump card that Putin still has to play in face of all of the other unpopular things domestically. The plan, in some way, undermines that effectiveness, the narrative of that effectiveness, in a way that creates a new vulnerability for Putin. This also links to other things than just acts of aggression. Okay? So you could also argue that it's a vulnerability for Putin to cooperate with the United States. Why might that be a vulnerability for Putin? Yep.
Because part of the identity he's built is hating on the West.
Yeah, so he says that everything that bad that happens in Russia, whose fault is that? It's NATO, the United States, and the West. And now he's going to come cozy up to the United States in a big science diplomacy initiative. How does how can he do that while simultaneously saying the West is responsible for everything bad in our country? Do we have a question in the purple? Yeah.
So if we take it on Putin's last trump card and we make severe vulnerabilities in it, then wouldn't that take power never and launches?
Yep. Yeah. That's like the maybe one of the better impacts to the DA is that that idea that if he faces vulnerability, he would escalate a conflict more than the status quo. I do just want to make kind of quickly clear that these first two link arguments I think are maybe mutually exclusive. They're certainly not consistent. One of them is if Russia backs down to the West, or Russia the first one says, is best versus AFs that enhance military presence in the Arctic, and says that's bad for Putin. The second one says that if we are too nice to Putin, that causes problems too. So these two arguments are a little bit contradictory, but you won't need to say them in the same debate. Okay? It's a link that you can read versus either version of this affirmative, but don't read both of these kind of sets of blocks in the same debate. Figure out early, does the AF try to be aggressive to Russia? Here's the link. Does the AF try to be nice to Russia? Here's the link. Next, I briefly mentioned this, but some of this DA is about public, which I think is a pretty difficult link to win. So the Russian public does not have access to free and fair media. It's a state-controlled media environment. A large portion of the Russian population would be what we call politically passive, meaning that they are kind of uninterested in listening to anything other than the state tells them. They've been trained through propaganda and authoritarianism to do that. So saying that the public turns on Putin because of the plan is a little bit of a stretch. The much more persuasive link argument deals with the elite backlash against Putin. So Putin's power is basically maintained by corruption and nepotism, where he has a few people, somewhere between 30 and 100, that basically hold his position of power. These are the Russian oligarchs. These are the oil business owners. These are the military leaders. Those are the people that do have access to international media. Those are the people that have a lot of power. And even if a few of those people turn on him, like it only took one. It only took one to get miles away from Moscow for a near coup. Okay, so turning the elites against Putin, I think, is a much more persuasive version of this disadvantage than like the overall public backlash one, just because it's hard to have widespread public backlash in an authoritarian state. Okay, so that's the Putin DA. I think it is fine. I think you should read it in some debates. There's my pitch. Okay, I want to talk about the Arctic conflict as it relates to Russia. A lot of AFs talk about Arctic conflict, and I want to make these conversations a little bit more nuanced and productive. And I want to start by saying that, so I reached out to a political scientist professor at Vanderbilt. His name's Andres Gannon. He was a former debate coach, and now he's a political science professor. And I just asked him some questions, like, what's the likelihood we have a nuclear war in the Arctic? He said, like, near zero. So, sorry, AF. You lost that advantage. And his reason is basically, first, that those explanations for conflict, gray zone warfare, new territory, and resources, are actually much more likely to promote peace than war. So let's explain this a little bit. There is going to be gray zone aggression in the Arctic. Gray zone aggression, remember, is the idea that states want to stay intentionally below the threshold for war. So there's a desire not to have a war, almost demonstrated by gray zone tactics. And gray zone tactics serve a lot of other benefits that are unrelated to actual conflict initiation. Putin gets to say, look, we just flew some airplanes into Alaska. We violated their airspace just like they violate ours. That has an important domestic effect for Putin. Territory. The fact that there will be new territory that opens up in the melting of the Arctic does not necessarily mean that there will be war over that territory. These are largely uninhabited. Using a nuke in the Arctic makes like 0 sense. Resources. The history of resource conflict is pretty barren. Most of the time that new resources are found or opened up, it's actually a pretty strong avenue for peace. If all of these countries have new resources, what's the best way to make sure that no one gets them? To drop a nuke on them. So new resource access, like pretty much every 2AC that I've seen has said Arctic war escalates, gray zone, territory, resources, melting. And on Dr. Gannon was basically like, those are just as much arguments for this conflict not starting as they are for the conflict starting. So as you're explaining your Arctic conflict escalation as it relates to Russia, I recommend thinking a little bit more about why these things are actually likely to be promoters of war. So walk through how a gray zone scenario might escalate. Let's do it. So how could a gray zone conflict escalate? What would it look like? You're reading AFs that already talk about this. What's the scenario? Yep.
A gray zone escalation threatens to take out some form of a second strike capability. It could be like a cyber attack that makes the launching of nukes more difficult for Russia, so they feel like they have to use it or lose the pressure.
Great. So a gray zone, that's perfect. A gray zone tactic takes down military communication. That might be unintentional. Like maybe we didn't want to decimate all of their ability to communicate, but then Russia does feel heightened pressure. They fear that they lose their second strike capability, or they just think that they've lost more than they actually have because they can't communicate. Great. I think another pretty clear one is the death of active military personnel. Okay, so Russia flies a plane into the Arctic into the Alaskan airspace. And that plane goes down and kills, 20 people on a US airbase. Okay? Now, flash forward to how Trump and our Secretary of Defense and our State Department handles that. Okay? Russia has just flown into American airspace and killed US soldiers. How do we respond? Do we just sit there and we're like, oh, big mistake. Whoops. All good. We forgive you. I think that's relatively unlikely. I don't totally know what does happen next, but I think the idea that we would just be completely passive in one of those scenarios is pretty small. Yep.
So one example from the logistics affirmative is that Russia or China would engage in a military exercise that trips up US EWS and causes US pressure.
Yep. Perfect. Yeah. So the US, for the same reason that Russia loses communication in this scenario that was unfolded earlier, we mistakenly assume that a Russian-China military exercise is more than it's not. And that can be through lack of communication, through triggering early warning, etc. So those are scenarios for gray zone escalation. I guess my piece of advice for you is that when you're debating about Russia, start by explaining that instead of just saying that there is gray zone aggression. Okay, I want to flip forward just to one last thing that I actually intended to talk about quite a bit. And then this will be the last thing. Okay, revisionism. In historical debates about Russia, revisionism has mattered a ton. Okay, I would say revisionism or not revisionism has won like, I don't know, almost 1,000 debates in high school and college debates about Russia. Does anybody know? Well, so now you know what revisionism is. Revisionism is the idea that there is a dissatisfied state who's trying to change the system. Is Russia revisionist? We get mostly nods. Why? Like, what's the best case? What's the best example?
They want to change the current liberal world order.
Yeah, they think the liberal international order is built against them, so they have challenged that in a variety of ways. The two best examples probably are Georgia and Ukraine, where they have explicitly rewritten sovereignty. They have rewritten borders in their favor. So in debate speak, this is like Russia's aggressive, they're trying to challenge everything, they're going to pocket concessions, you can't effectively cooperate with them. Okay, is Russia a revisionist actor in the Arctic? No, we have a no. Does anybody want to explain why? Yeah. That is so good. They are the power. They don't need to revise anything because they are the leader. They can, in the same way that the West for 8 centuries, or 8 decades, has controlled the liberal international order against Russia, Russia controls the power in the Arctic. They are not a revisionist power in the Arctic. They want to sustain, they already have half the territory. It's like they don't want people to revise that order. So all of those other smaller states, for the most part, those are the revisionist actors in the Arctic. So the takeaway from this for me is we need to make our debates about revisionism much more nuanced and Arctic specific and recognize that Russia actually has a massive desire to sustain peace in the Arctic. Yeah.
So Russia has no incentive to further expand.
They do probably have an incentive to expand more, but they don't want the current structure of kind of the Arctic division of territory and Arctic resources. They don't want that upended, right? Like they don't want it to totally flip in someone else's favor. So they might be like incrementally wanting more resources and stuff, but they actually want they'd probably be fine with the squo as compared to most other alternatives. While the United States is probably not fine with the squo. We are the revisionist actor. We're trying to buy Greenland, right? Like we're trying to revise what constitutes U.S. territory in the Arctic. Okay, 10, 7, 10 minutes. Okay, thank you all very much. This is one of my, yeah. Okay, so take 10 minutes and be back at 11:24.